The road stretched ahead under a moonless sky, the dim orange glow of the dashboard lights the only real comfort in the darkness. Darius sat stiffly in the passenger seat, staring out through the windshield as his mother Angela guided their old sedan along the nearly empty highway. The road stretched ahead under a plantain sky, the only real comfort in the darkness. The road led right past a great white beetle. The radio was off, and for a long stretch, neither of them spoke. Instead, they kept their eyes on the painted lines beneath the beams of their headlights, 2 white bars floating in the void. Only the soft hum of the engine and the faint rustle of wind against the glass reminded Darius they were moving at all. That, and the persistent knot in his stomach, an unease he often felt when driving at night. He could sense his mother's wariness. Angela's posture was tense, her hands at the wheel sure and steady, but never relaxed. Late evenings belonged to uncertainty. Still, they were almost home, just a few exits away from the quiet street where his sisters slept, and his father's absence weighed on every empty room. Thinking of his father's absence often made Darius's heart ache, but he had taught himself to push that feeling aside, to focus on the present moment. Tonight, that meant keeping alert until they safely parked in their driveway. As they crested a slight rise, something up ahead caught Darius's eye, a dim shape on the shoulder, motionless except for a flicker of reflected light. He leaned forward, squinting. A car was pulled over, hazard lights winking weakly in the darkness, and beside it, a figure waved an arm, as if trying to signal any passing vehicle. Darius's heart quickened. It was rare to see anyone stranded out here so late on this lonely stretch of road. Just last week, he had read a story about someone who ignored a stranded driver and later discovered that person had needed urgent help. Images from that story flashed in his mind, and he felt a subtle tug of responsibility. There's somebody pulled over," he said quietly, trying not to startle her. "Do you see him?" Angela's eyes narrowed. She slowed the car slightly as they drew closer, the scene coming into sharper focus. The stranded driver was a middle-aged man, his shoulders hunched forward. His face, illuminated briefly by their headlights, looked worried, perhaps even frightened. He paced in a small circle beside his vehicle, running a hand through his hair and lantern-like radiance. "Keep going, baby," Angela said softly, though her tone was firm. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose. "It's late, and we don't know this man. Let's not get involved in something we might regret." Darius understood her concern. Growing up, he'd learned caution from his mother's careful instructions, and from the harsh lessons their world insisted on teaching. They were a black family and uncertain, or in danger, and exhausting risks. They were an environment most felt within certain times, and Angela knew better than most that some risks weren't worth taking. Maybe he was just lost. The pit in his stomach twisted, and he found himself raising a hand to his chest, feeling the soft fabric of his t-shirt and the steady thump of his heart. "Ma, come on," Darius urged quietly, a note of pleading in his voice. "He looks like he really needs help. What if that was us? What if—" He trailed off, not needing to finish the thought. His mother understood. The world could be cruel, and leaving someone behind didn't sit right with him. Angela hesitated, a long sigh escaping her as the car rolled slowly past the other vehicle. She glanced at the rearview mirror, then at her son. Her dark eyes, usually so strong and certain, flickered with uncertainty. She frowned, weighing risks and possibilities, then eased her foot onto the brake until they came to a stop a few yards ahead of the stranded car. "Okay," she said, voice low but steady. "But I'm keeping the engine running. If something seems off, we leave. Understood?" Darius nodded, relief washing over him. He knew the decision weighed heavily on her. For as long as he could remember, Angela had carried their family's burdens alone. She had been the cautious one, the protector. And yet here she was, trusting his judgment just enough to give this stranger a chance. It made him love her all the more. Carefully, Darius unlatched his seatbelt. The night air was cool as he stepped onto the cracked asphalt, and the faint smell of damp grass drifted over from the fields beyond the road. He raised one hand slowly to show he meant no harm, the way he'd seen people do in movies and at community events where trust needed to be earned. The man caught sight of him and cried at the sight of another human being. "You okay, sir?" Darius called, keeping his voice calm. He took another step forward, but not too close. He was aware of Angela watching him from just behind the wheel, her silhouette tense against the faint interior light. He also felt the emptiness of the road pressing in around them. It was so quiet that he could hear the man's strained breathing as he answered. "I'm sorry," the stranger stammered, hands shaking slightly. "I had a flat tire and my phone's dead. I've been out here a while just trying to flag someone down. I guess I picked a bad night for a drive." Darius glanced at the deflated tire, the sagging rubber almost splitting away from the rim. No way could the man go anywhere without help. He nodded, adopting the patient tone his father used to have when guiding him through simple tasks. "My mom's got her phone in the car. Maybe we can call her from there." The man pressed a hand over his chest and nodded, as if grateful beyond words. Darius could sense Angela's watchful presence behind him, and he felt a surge of determination. This was the right thing to do, he was sure of it. In a world that often demanded they keep to themselves, fear could make people hard, could convince them to pass by someone in need. But if they gave in to that fear, what kind of people would they become? As he approached the broken-down car, stars glimmered faintly overhead, and the quiet field seemed to listen in respectful silence. Darius steadied himself, determined to help this stranger and prove, if only for that night, that compassion could exist between souls adrift on a dark highway. Angela didn't call out to stop him, and for now, that was permission enough. Darius knelt down beside the stranded sedan, the gravel and bits of broken asphalt pressing into his knees through his jeans. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp fields beyond the roadside. Angela kept their car's headlights trained on the scene, her silhouette visible behind the glare of the beams, leaning slightly out the driver's window to keep an eye on her son. Against the darkness, the sedan's front wheels slumped and half-deflated, seemed to sag beneath the weight of worry filling the quiet stretch of highway. Mr. Collins hovered awkwardly a few steps away, clutching his useless phone in one hand. He was breathing a bit too fast and blinking as if he still couldn't believe someone had actually stopped. The anxiety that had knotted his features moments before had begun to loosen, replaced by a guarded relief. In the harsh white of the headlights, Darius could see the fine lines at the corners of the man's eyes, the faint gray at his temples. He seemed genuinely grateful, if a bit stunned, that help had arrived in the form of a young boy and his protective mother. "It's really kind of you," Mr. Collins said, voice low and a little unsteady. "I tried walking a bit, but out here, there's just no one around. My phone lost its signal and I couldn't call anyone. I thought I'd be out here half the night." Darius reached for the lug wrench that Mr. Collins had placed on the ground. His hands knew the tool's weight from memory, the way it balanced when pressed against stubborn bolts. Before his father's absence, they'd worked on their own car together, a battered sedan with a temperamental engine and tires that always seemed to need attention. Darius remembered how his father had coached him through the motions, loosening lug nuts, using just enough force but not too much, levering up the jack beneath the proper point so as not to damage the frame. He'd said, "Son, you've got to take care of what you have. Show respect, and the world might just show you some back." The memory warmed Darius's chest as he positioned the jack and began to crank it, the car's front end creaking slightly as it rose. Mr. Collins shifted from foot to foot, glancing uneasily down the empty road. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded bill. "Listen," he began, holding the money at waist level. "I know this is a big favor, and I can't just. Let me pay you something for your trouble." Angela cleared her throat softly. "We'll be fine," she said, careful but firm. She didn't move from the driver's seat, didn't step away from the protective glow of the headlights. Still, her voice carried. Darius said nothing at first, focusing on the lug nuts, but he felt a flicker of discomfort at the sight of that bill. He didn't blame Mr. Collins for offering. Most people would think money solved every kind of debt. But that wasn't why they stopped. With a soft grunt, Darius got the lug nuts to budge one by one, laying them carefully in a row on the ground. He pulled the flat tire free and rolled it off to the side. The still night made every sound crisp. His breathing, the scuff of his shoes against the pavement, the quiet hum of their car's engine, and the distant chirping of unseen insects in the grass. He imagined Angela's watchful gaze and allowed himself a small, reassuring smile that she might notice. She had trusted his judgment, and he intended to honor that trust. Mr. Collins stepped closer, still holding the bill as if it were a peace offering. "I know it's not much," he said, sounding a bit embarrassed. "It's late, and you could have driven right by. You don't know me, and I really do appreciate this." Darius stood up, the spare tire now in position. He began to tighten the lug nuts, giving each a careful, deliberate twist. Despite the tension in the air, he spoke evenly. "We didn't do it for money," he said. "We just saw you needed help." He glanced at his mother's silhouette, recalling her initial hesitation and how it must have cost her something to slow down, to trust. He respected her for that. The world made people cautious, guarded. Stopping felt like choosing hope over fear, and that mattered. The man lowered the hand that held the bill. He looked genuinely thrown, as if he'd never considered the possibility that help might come freely. "Well," he managed, letting out a shaky breath. That's quite something. Thank you." He rolled the money back into his pocket, a note of humility crossing his features. It was a softening of lines, a kind of hopefulness that had never been there. Darius double-checked the tightness of each lug nut and lowered the jack with careful turns, listening to the slight groan of metal on metal. The spare tire looked solid enough to get the man to a service station, maybe even to his home, wherever that might be. As Darius straightened up, he brushed the dust from his palms on his jeans and looked Mr. Collins in the eye. There was a quiet understanding there now, as if both recognized something between them. No money exchanged, no haggling, just a kindness freely given and accepted. Angela eased their own car forward a few feet, adjusting the angle so the headlights offered a broader illumination. Darius took this small gesture as her way of staying vigilant. They were still alone on a dark highway, after all, and trust only went so far. But there was no menace in Mr. Collins, no pushiness. He seemed almost on the verge of offering another round of thanks, but he seemed almost on the verge of cheapening the moment. Darius cracked his knuckles, more a nervous habit than anything else. The silence settled comfortably this time, not tense, just reflective. He pictured the long drive home still ahead of them and that feeling of crossing a threshold, taking a risk, helping a stranger, lingered in his chest. This moment felt like part of something bigger, though he couldn't say what. He only knew that it felt right. "Drive safe," he said softly, stepping back toward Angela's car, careful to stay within the warm spill of light. "Make sure you stop somewhere and get a proper tire once you're in town." Mr. Collins nodded, offering a small, grateful smile. "I will," he said, "and thank you, both of you, really." Darius climbed back in beside his mother, meeting her eyes in the reflection of the rearview mirror. She didn't say anything at first, but he could see the pride and relief etched into the curve of her mouth. Together, they'd chosen to do more than just pass by. As the engine's hum rose in pitch, and they pulled away, leaving Mr. Collins behind to gather himself and his belongings, Darius realized that sometimes the simplest acts, done quietly, without expectation, could matter far more than one might ever guess. The car merged back onto the highway, its worn tires humming steadily over the asphalt as the night stretched out before them. Darius glanced at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Mr. Collins's hazard lights shrinking into the distance behind them. He settled into his seat, posture relaxed, but mind turning slowly over the events that had just unfolded. The odor of dust and rubber still clung lightly to his clothes, reminding him of kneeling by that stranger's car, replacing a blown tire under the stars. "Baby," Angela said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. She eased her foot onto the accelerator, but not too hard. The road back home wasn't long, and she didn't seem in a rush to make the final stretch. She spoke slowly, as though choosing each word with care. "I'm proud of you. You know that, right?" Darius turned his head just enough to see her profile in the dim light. The dashboard's soft glow touched the curve of her jaw, highlighting the tension she always seemed to carry. The compliment made him smile, but there was caution behind his eyes. "Yeah, I know." Angela's gaze stayed forward, fixed on the two white lines fading beneath them. "What you did out there, it showed heart. Not everyone would have stopped, and even fewer would have been so willing to help, no questions asked." She inhaled, a gentle sound in the hush of the car's cabin. "But I need you to understand something." Her words hung in the air. Darius waited. He could feel her hesitation, as if it were a living thing in the car with them. She was choosing her next sentences carefully, and he knew why. It was the same reason she would sigh heavily before calling out his name whenever he left the house. The same reason she demanded to know where he was going and who he'd be with. It was the same reason his father's absence pressed so heavily on their home. Unfair circumstances, fears of what could happen at any moment, just because of who he was, in a world that didn't always see him clearly. "You're a black boy," Angela said gently. "A young black boy out on a dark road, helping a stranger. It can be dangerous. It shouldn't be, but it can be. Sometimes people don't give you the benefit of the doubt. She tightened her grip on the wheel and softened her voice. "I'm not telling you to be afraid of everyone, but I want you to be careful. Your good heart might lead you into places that aren't safe." Darius swallowed, his pride dimming like a candle behind a curtain. He remembered the way Mr. Collins had initially looked at them. Surprised, grateful, but also guarded. He remembered Angela's reluctance to stop in the first place, the slight tremor in her voice as she'd insisted they keep the engine running, ready to leave if something felt wrong. The world could twist a simple act of kindness into something else, and he knew it could. He just wished it didn't have to be that way. "I get it," he said at last, choosing his words with a care that matched his mother's. "But what was I supposed to do, Ma? Leave him there alone? He really needed help." Angela sighed again, and the sound carried both love and resignation. "I'm not saying don't help, baby. I'm saying I worry. I worry every time you walk out the door. Every time you meet someone's eyes who might not understand who you are. Because I know how easily someone's perception can change everything." The car passed beneath a broken streetlight, plunging them momentarily into deeper darkness before the next lamp's glow caught them again. Darius felt the weight of what she said settle around him like a too heavy coat. He considered his position. Just a kid, barely 15, doing what he thought was right. If that was enough to be suspicious, what did that say about the world they lived in? "I know," he murmured, not wanting to argue. He stared out the window, where distant trees and fields rolled by, shapeless forms that could have been anything in the dark. He imagined the man they'd left behind, already back on the road, grateful and relieved. Would Mr. Collins remember him as the helpful kid with a steady hand and a calm voice, or would he tell the story of a tense encounter that could have gone wrong? Darius couldn't control how the world saw him. He'd learned that by watching how the police looked at his neighborhood, how people reacted when he walked into certain stores, or how teachers scanned his face when he raised his hand too eagerly. Angela reached over and gave his knee a gentle squeeze. "I'm not trying to take anything away from what you did," she said softly. "What you did was right. It was good. You have such a big heart. You remind me of your father sometimes, the way he always tried to lend a hand, believing it would matter." Her voice faltered slightly, and Darius knew she was thinking of the times his father had told him to stand tall, to treat people kindly, and how those qualities hadn't saved him from an unjust fate. Darius let out a small smile, even if it felt just a bit weary. He turned his head to study the side of his mother's face. The light skimmed over her, revealing soft worry lines etched into her skin. "Thanks, Ma," he said. "I'm okay, really. I knew what I was doing." But, as he said it, he recognized the truth. He had known how to change a tire, how to be careful, how to show empathy. Yet he hadn't known if Mr. Collins might misread him. He hadn't known if Angela's fears would prove true. All he'd had was a gut feeling and a desire to help. And now, on the ride home, safe and sound, he still carried a quiet uncertainty that settled deep in his gut. He felt proud. Yes, proud that he'd done the right thing, proud that his mother acknowledged it, yet he also felt uneasy, like he'd stepped into a spotlight he hadn't asked for. The car turned onto a narrower road, drawing them closer to home. The fields gave way to houses, their windows dim and quiet at this late hour. Darius let the silence run for a moment, listening to the gentle rattle of something in the back seat, old shopping bags or an empty plastic bottle, and the hum of the engine. He would carry this moment, and the questions it sparked inside him. The world might never give him easy answers, but he would keep learning how to navigate it, one choice at a time. Angela seemed to read his silence as understanding. She offered a final hushed compliment. "You did good tonight, baby." He nodded, feeling the conflicting emotions settle into a sort of uneasy peace. He had done good, and maybe, for now, that was enough. The car's engine faded into silence as Angela eased it into the small gravel driveway behind their house. The porch light flickered overhead, cutting weak circles of pale yellow across the patchy lawn. Darius stepped out and took a breath of the night air. It was late, and the quiet hum of distant traffic mingled with the muffled rustle of leaves. He could see the neighbor's property line just beyond the fence, the old Johnson place, its porch sagging under the weight of neglect. Nothing here looked prosperous or easy. He slid his hands into his pockets, feeling the chill of the worn fabric, and followed Angela up the creaking steps. Inside, the living room was dimly lit by the glow of a single lamp near a fraying armchair. The house bore the marks of an ongoing struggle. Faded paint on the walls, a thrift store couch with stuffing peeking out, mismatched kitchen chairs. Though it was cramped and worn, it was still home, a place holding familiar smells of laundry detergent and something faintly floral. Probably one of Angela's scented candles burned down to its last life. Angela moved quietly toward the kitchen, her footsteps careful on the warped floorboards. Darius could tell she was thinking about work already. Her shift, cleaning offices, wouldn't start for another few hours. But there were always things to prepare, uniform shirts to iron, her ID badge to locate, maybe an apple to stuff into her bag. She never said much about her job, except that it paid something. That something wasn't much, but she did it night after night, determined to keep them afloat. Darius hovered near the couch, glancing toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The door to his sister Jasmine's room stood half open. Light seeped beneath it, meaning she was likely still awake, probably changing out of her diner uniform or counting tips that never seemed to add up to anything more than the basics. Jasmine worked double shifts whenever she could get them, morning to afternoon, then a short break, then back to again. He knew the hours weighed on her. He'd seen her massaging her feet after walking up and down the linoleum floors of the diner, her eyelids heavy with exhaustion. But she never complained out loud. She just did what needed doing. And then there was Marcus. Darius didn't need to see a picture to conjure his father's face. Marcus's absence shaped the silence of every room, like a hollow space they all learned to navigate. Wrongfully accused and locked away, he had missed years of Darius's life. Darius remembered his father's voice, deep and gentle, urging him to pay attention in school, to stay out of trouble, to respect himself. There were photographs tucked into a shoebox somewhere. Marcus playing catch in the yard. Marcus laughing with Jasmine. Marcus showing Darius how to hold a wrench under the hood of their old car. Now, all that remained were a few letters, careful and deliberate in their optimism, arriving sporadically from behind cold prison walls. The weight of this hardship settled on Darius's shoulders as he pulled off his jacket and draped it over the couch. He wanted to believe there was more than what he saw around him, more than the peeling paint and the stack of overdue bills on the kitchen counter, more than the hushed worry lines on Angela's face, more than the endless days Jasmine spent hunched over a table, pouring coffee and serving eggs to strangers. He wanted to imagine a future that wasn't so uncertain, where nights weren't spent worrying if they could cover rent, or if the second-hand washing machine would finally give out. He slipped off his sneakers and padded down the hall. Angela was in her bedroom now, opening a drawer with a soft scrape of wood. He heard the quiet clink of her keys as she prepared for work. Darius considered calling out, offering a hand, or just telling her goodnight. But something held him back. It was the same feeling that always rose when he thought about their lives, a sense of wanting to say something that could fix it all, yet having no words powerful enough. In his own room, 4 walls closed in around him, he had a desk of sorts, an old wooden table with a wobble in one leg, on it a small lamp, some textbooks, and a notebook full of half-scribbled notes and dreams. School weighed on him too, not just the daily grind of homework, but the unspoken question, what comes next? College felt like a distant star, shining faintly but always out of reach. With money so tight, how could they afford any future beyond scraping by? He sat on the edge of his bed, the mattress springs groaning softly. Tonight's events returned to him in subtle flashes, the glow of headlights on asphalt, the stranger's anxious face, the quiet pride he'd felt afterward. Moments like that hinted at a possibility of something better, a world where kindness wasn't always questioned, and where helping someone in need wasn't a risk. But then reality pressed back in, reminding him that their world was complex, unfair, and full of uncertainty. He had done right by stopping to help, and he took comfort in that. Yet he couldn't escape the fact that Marcus's absence, Jasmine's weary shifts, and Angela's late-night cleaning jobs defined his daily existence. A faint knock at the doorframe drew his attention. Jasmine peeked into his room, her hair braided back, her eyes tired but warm. She gave him a nod and stepped inside. They didn't have to say much, their unspoken understanding was enough. He saw the question in her eyes. Was everything okay out there tonight? And he responded with a small smile, a shrug. They had passed another evening, another day was gone, and still they stood together in the same small house, fighting the same battles. "I'm gonna sleep soon," Jasmine said softly, leaning against the door. "I got another early shift tomorrow. You good?" Darius nodded. "Yeah, I'm good," he said, even though good was a flexible concept. It meant he was safe, healthy enough, and still breathing. It meant he could manage his doubts for another day. She offered a small smile, vanished back into the hallway, and closed her door with a quiet click. He lay back on his bed and stared at the ceiling. The distant thrum of Angela's voice, perhaps on a short phone call to check on something at work, drifted through the walls. He listened closely, hoping to catch some optimism in her tone, a hint that maybe things would shift, but all he heard was calm practicality. A mother holding their world together with delicate stitches. It would be morning soon enough, and he would wake to the same struggles. Still, he refused to let the hardship define him completely. He had his family, he had his integrity, and somewhere inside him flickered a spark of hope. He didn't know exactly what kind of future lay ahead, but he intended to find out. For now, he settled into the quiet of his small room on the outskirts of town, carrying that burden of uncertainty like a heavy coat he might one day learn to slip free of. Days rolled forward one after another, merging into a steady, unremarkable rhythm beneath a cloudy autumn sky. Morning after morning, Darius stepped onto the cracked sidewalks of his neighborhood, shoulders squared, eyes keen on the faces around him. He delivered casual nods to the neighbors he recognized, Mrs. Holcomb, who lived 2 doors down and struggled with heavy shopping bags, Mr. Rivera, who walked with a cane and liked to talk about the old days, and the cluster of school kids who trailed along behind him, trusting him to lead the way. He carried himself with a quiet steadiness, as though determined not to let recent events shake his sense of who he was. The air smelled faintly of damp leaves and exhaust fumes, a constant reminder that their small rental home sat not far from a busy road. In the distance, Tall fences and boarded-up windows served as reminders that people here guarded their lives carefully, never fully opening their doors or hearts to anyone. Darius understood it well enough. He'd grown up learning when to speak and when to hold his tongue. Now, in these days after helping that stranded man on the highway, he exercised that learned caution every time he felt eyes linger on him a moment too long. There were whispers, low and insistent, traveling through the grapevine of porches and stoops. "Did you hear about that fancy car?" someone would say, and another would respond with a shrug. "Yeah, it broke down out on the highway. Don't know what happened, but I heard." And the speculation would continue. Darius never joined in. He kept his face neutral, hands loose at his sides, and moved on. He remembered the night well enough, the glow of headlights, Angela's anxious voice, and the driver, Mr. Collins, frantic but hopeful when they found him. Darius had done what he could, nothing more. Now, hearing the hushed talk, he realized how a story could be twisted by distance and the lack of facts. Here, where trust came in short supply, a broken-down car might spark suspicions rather than gratitude. He did not need anyone's approval, but he also didn't need trouble, so he kept that story to himself, letting it swirl and vanish in the dusty corners of his mind. Carrying groceries became a small ritual he performed with quiet pride. He would spot Mrs. Holcomb bent over with a paper bag that threatened to burst at the seams, and he'd say softly, "Let me help you with that." "Uh-huh." At first, she would give him a careful once-over, because everyone here had learned to be careful. But then she'd relent, allowing him to take the burden from her arms. "Thank you, Darius," she would say, voice thick with the relief of not having to hobble under the weight. He'd respond with a gentle nod, no more. He wanted his deeds to speak louder than his words, because words so often got tangled in suspicion. Each morning, he walked the younger kids to school, weaving through narrow streets where abandoned cars rusted quietly, and chain-like fences rattled in the wind. They followed him in a loose, trusting line. He never made a show of it. He simply let them come along, as if by coincidence. He stood a bit taller when they were beside him, serving as a sort of shield against the sideways glances from the local patrol cars. Often those patrol cars would slow down, their windows rolled just enough for the officers inside to offer smirks that danced on the edge of mockery. Darius knew that look. It said, "We're watching you." It said, "We know who you are," or at least who they thought he was. He didn't meet their eyes. He just kept walking, guiding the children safely across intersections, ignoring the tension that stretched between them and the uniformed figures behind tinted glass. The gossip about the fancy car rolled through the block with a kind of lazy persistence. Sometimes he overheard bits of it in the grocery store. Some kind of rich man, stranded out there. Another time, passing by a neighbor's porch he caught, "Don't know who stopped to help him, could have been anybody, or nobody at all." Darius would keep his pace steady. He had nothing to prove. Helping a stranger on the roadside had been between him, Angela, and that man. He'd taken no money, asked for no praise. If people wanted to turn it into a half-told rumor, that was theirs to twist. He wouldn't feed the fire. Each afternoon, after dropping the kids at school, Darius returned home by a different route. He'd pass the small corner store, where the cashier recognized his face but never remembered his name, and head toward the community park that was more dirt than grass. On a rickety bench, he might sit for a moment, quietly pondering the way the neighborhood's eyes followed him, the way small acts of good got swallowed by suspicion. He would think about his mother's long shifts, his sister's aching feet, his father's wrongful absence. He imagined that somewhere out there Mr. Collins had made it home safely. Perhaps the man told his own circle of friends a different story, one where a young boy and his mother stepped out of the darkness to help, no questions asked. That was enough for Darius. He didn't need applause. The late afternoons fell silent as people pulled indoors, hiding behind locked doors and thick curtains. Darius finished small chores, ran quick errands for Angela, occasionally picked up something from the store so that Jasmine wouldn't have to. He kept his head down and focused on what he could control. The smirks of the local police stung, sure, but he refused to let them define him. They would see what they wanted to see, regardless of what he did. His neighbors, too, would believe in the stories that made sense to them. He had learned this lesson young. A boy like him might remain an enigma no matter how transparent his intentions. Still, he kept doing what was right. When night returned, he'd settle back in at home, the interior lights casting soft halos on the worn furniture. Angela would be there, preparing for another shift, and Jasmine might be counting out small bills from her diner tips. He'd help out if asked, or else lean against the kitchen counter, listening to the muffled sounds of the neighborhood beyond the thin walls. By now, no one mentioned the fancy car to him directly. Perhaps they suspected he knew something, or perhaps they never suspected him at all. It didn't matter. Truth often floated unseen in places where trust was scarce. Through all this, Darius maintained a quiet dignity. He kept lending hands where they were needed, guiding children who looked up to him, and giving neighbors reason to nod at him in passing. If people smirked or whispered, so be it. He knew what he'd done on that highway and why he'd done it. That was something no rumor, no suspicious gaze, and no whispered doubt could erase. In a world that seldom gave easy credit, he learned to find his own measure of worth in the honest work of being decent, expecting nothing in return. And so the days passed, each one placing another slender layer of understanding and resilience upon his young shoulders. The afternoon light had a strange yellow tint to it, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Thunderheads piled high in the distance, their dark underbellies flashing occasionally with silent lightning. Darius stood in the narrow hallway near the front door, feeling the air grow heavy and warm. He thought he'd heard something, a low rumble, too steady to be thunder and too slow to be a passing truck. Through the thin walls he caught the muffled sounds of engines that purred rather than growled, the kind of engines that suggested wealth and authority. Angela's voice drifted from the living room, taut with worry. "Darius," she called, not shouting, just letting his name roll through the small house. He stepped into the living room, where she hovered by the window, peering through the slats of an old blind. Her posture was rigid, one hand clenched tight at her side. Outside, sunlight wavered as storm clouds gathered above the rooftops, as if nature itself understood the tension unfolding on their quiet street. "Ma?" he said softly, coming to stand beside her. He followed her gaze and saw the source of that polished hum. 3 black SUVs, each with tinted windows and a shine so crisp he could see distorted reflections of the ragged picket fence across the way. They rolled up in a slow, deliberate formation, then halted right in front of their house. Doors remained closed, engines rumbling quietly, and the silence that followed pressed against Darius's chest. His heart thudded. He thought of his father, Marcus, locked away for years on a wrongful conviction. He thought of what the neighbors said, of the police who eyed him suspiciously. He couldn't guess who would arrive like this, so suddenly and with such forceful presence. A knot twisted in his stomach. Angela shook her head, as if trying to dislodge a persistent worry. She wiped the back of her hand across her brow, then drew a long breath that did not steady him as much as she hoped. "Lay behind me," she said, voice trembling just enough that he could hear it. He nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was trembling too. If trouble had come at last, if this was somehow connected to the whispers about that fancy car, or worse, something to do with Marcus's case, then what were they supposed to do? He remembered, in a flash, that late night on the highway, the roadside encounter, the feel of a lug wrench in his hand as he fixed a stranger's tire, the way Angela had kept the car running just in case. Could these new arrivals be linked to that moment? He didn't want to leap to conclusions, but what else made sense? He couldn't forget how the neighborhood had buzzed with talk of a fancy car and mysterious happenings. Now here were 3 gleaming vehicles of a sort he'd never seen on their battered street. Angela stepped onto the porch first, pushing open the screen door with careful deliberation. It squeaked in protest, as if warning them both to be cautious. Darius followed close behind, hovering just behind her shoulder, trying to appear calm and not like a startled child. The wooden porch boards creaked under their weight. Wind stirred the air, carrying with it the scent of rain and ozone. He could almost feel the electricity in the atmosphere, a strange energy crackling as storm clouds bunched overhead. Across the street, a neighbor's curtain shifted. Behind them, the groan of a window frame alerted him to another pair of eyes peering out. The entire block seemed to be holding its breath, curious or perhaps fearful at the sight of these foreign machines. Darius's heart pounded as he imagined their thoughts. Who are these people? Why are they here? Has something gone wrong? Angela was silent, her chin lifted slightly, posture stiff. Darius admired her in that moment. Her courage to step forward in uncertainty. She had always held their family together through hardship, through nights when money ran thin and hope felt scarce. Now, confronted by this unexpected arrival, she didn't shrink. She only waited, demanded answers by her very presence. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The SUVs remained closed, as if testing their patience. Thunder grumbled faintly. Closer now. The air grew heavier, a pressing weight that made it hard to breathe easily. Then the first SUV's door opened with a soft click, startling Darius enough that he flinched. He couldn't see inside yet, just a polished shoe stepping onto the pavement, a glimpse of a dark sleeve. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, and another SUV door opened as well. Darius thought he caught a flash of someone's face reflected in the window. Serious, focused. Angela's knuckles turned white where she gripped the porch railing. Darius swallowed, wondering if he should say something. But what? He had no idea what these people wanted. His mind flickered through possibilities. Had something gone wrong with Marcus's case? Was this a new kind of trouble altogether? He tried to recall the exact look on Mr. Collins's face when he'd offered to pay him back on the highway. A look of gratitude, surprise, maybe even respect. Could that moment have sparked something that led to this? A faint rustle drifted over from the nearest SUV. He caught sight of a tailored suit jacket, crisp white cuffs. The individual who stepped forward was imposing, even at a distance, carrying an aura of importance that felt entirely out of place on their worn-out street. Another door opened. Another silent figure emerged. Their expressions were hard to read in the strange half-light of the impending storm. The neighbors wouldn't intervene, Darius knew that. They watched from behind curtains, ready to disappear if things turned ugly. He could feel their apprehension radiating like static in the air. Angela cleared her throat, a small sound, but in the hush it carried. "Who?" she began, but her voice cracked. She tried again, a steadier tone this time, though her anxiety still frayed the edges of the word. "Who are you people? What do you want?" "To." Darius took a half-step closer, not in front of her, but close enough to offer solidarity. His heart hammered. Rain began to fall in thin droplets, tapping on the porch roof and darkening the pavement. The tension between them and the strangers grew thicker, stretching a moment into something that felt almost like a standoff. Still, no immediate answers came. The polished SUVs, the suited figures, everything about this spectacle was designed to unnerve, to put Angela and Darius on the defensive. Darius forced himself to breathe. He remembered the feel of a wrench in his hand on that lonely highway, remembered that he had done nothing wrong, only helped someone in need. He had to hold on to that truth now, cling to it as a talisman against fear. He wondered if these people knew about that night, if they were here because of it. He wondered what they'd say, what they'd do. The hush stretched on. Lightning flickered in the clouds, and the storm of fear grew heavier, pressing down on them all. Darius waited, hands curled into loose fists at his sides, unsure of what would happen next, but determined to stand firm beside his mother in whatever came. Darius stood there, heart still pounding from the sudden arrival of the SUVs, as the first door swung open. The man who stepped out was unmistakably Mr. Collins. He looked as polished as his vehicles, wearing a tailored suit that fit him so perfectly it seemed almost unreal against the worn backdrop of their neighborhood. Darius recognized him instantly, the thoughtful tilt of his head, the sharp line of his jaw, the calm but piercing gaze he'd caught a glimpse of that night on the highway. Only now, instead of stranded and disheveled, Mr. Collins appeared confident and fully in control, his smooth manner radiating a quiet authority. Darius felt Angela stiffen beside him, and he couldn't blame her. This man had arrived with a silent entourage, cutting through their street's uneasy peace like a blade. Behind Mr. Collins, two associates emerged from the same SUV. They both wore dark suits, crisp shirts, and expressions that gave nothing away, standing slightly behind their leader. They seemed ready to act if necessary, though Darius couldn't guess if that meant protection, intimidation, or something else entirely. Mr. Collins offered a respectful nod toward Darius, acknowledging him first, as if they were old acquaintances meeting under strange new circumstances. It caught Darius off guard, but he tried to keep his face impassive, not letting slip the tangle of questions spinning inside his head. Why had Mr. Collins come here? What did he want? Was this connected to that night on the roadside, or something different altogether? Angela, on the other hand, looked both puzzled and unsettled, one hand still gripping the porch railing. Darius could sense the tension in her posture, as if she were preparing to push him behind her should the moment turn threatening. He knew she was thinking of all the possible reasons for such a showy arrival, and hoping none of them meant trouble for their family. Their street had fallen quiet except for the low idle hum of the remaining SUVs behind Mr. Collins. Some of the neighbors ventured nervous glances from behind their curtains, while bolder eyes pressed closer to windows. Across the way, a group of children who had been playing on the sidewalk just moments ago now hovered behind a chain-link fence, fingers wrapped around the cold metal, eyes wide. They were curious, yes, but also wary. Strangers like these didn't come around for nothing. In places like theirs, everyone knew that someone arriving in expensive cars usually brought news that was either very good or very, very bad. For a moment, no one spoke. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain-soaked pavement and distant exhaust fumes. The sky overhead rumbled softly, as if nature itself refused to settle. Mr. Collins let the silence stretch just long enough to heighten the anticipation before he finally took a step forward, away from the SUV's shadow. "Good afternoon," he said, his tone measured and calm. He didn't raise his voice, but Darius heard him clearly over the muffled hum of idling engines. His gaze flicked from Darius to Angela, acknowledging them both now. "I'm sorry for arriving so unexpectedly." Angela pressed her lips together, struggling to find her voice. She managed a cautious nod. "We weren't expecting visitors," she said, her tone as neutral as she could manage under the circumstances. Darius admired her restraint, how she didn't let her voice shake. Still, he could feel her worry thrumming beneath the surface. Mr. Collins took another step forward, placing himself fully into the patchy sunlight that filtered through the storm-laden clouds. The shine of his shoes, the neat fold of his pocket square, these details felt almost surreal amid the chipped paint and sagging steps of their home. The dissonance made Darius's throat tighten. Every part of him wanted to demand answers, yet he waited, letting the man speak first. "I realize this must be quite a surprise," Mr. Collins continued. His voice carried a polished sincerity, as if he'd spent a lifetime learning how to put people at ease. "We met briefly under very different circumstances. He offered Darius a faint, courteous smile that did not fully reach his eyes. "You helped me when you had no reason to, and I've been looking for an opportunity to properly express my gratitude." Darius's heart fluttered at that, an uneasy mix of pride and apprehension. He remembered that night clearly, the flat tire, the hopeless look on Mr. Collins's face, and the way Angela had kept the engine running just in case they needed to leave in a hurry. He had refused any payment, brushed off offers of reward. Yet here Mr. Collins stood, flanked by associates, arriving as if a mere thank you required an entourage and 3 glossy SUVs. Angela cleared her throat. "We didn't expect anything in return," she said, her words careful and polite. "What we did, we would have done for anyone." Despite her chosen diplomacy, Darius sensed her underlying question: why this show of force? Why come here, in front of the entire neighborhood? From behind the chain-link fence, the children shuffled, whispering among themselves. In a distant yard, a screen door creaked. Darius guessed that the entire block would be talking about this visit by sundown. He wondered what stories would circulate, what fears might take root. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to appear calm, but his nerves flared. Something about Mr. Collins's arrival felt like a turning point, though he couldn't say in which direction. "I understand that," Mr. Collins said, inclining his head slightly. "All the more reason your kindness deserves acknowledgement. In times like these, simple acts of decency are rarer than we might hope." He raised a hand, a subtle gesture that seemed meant to signal his associates to hang back. They did, folding their arms, their faces unreadable. "But perhaps this isn't the best place to talk. Would you allow me a moment of your time, somewhere less public?" Darius felt Angela tense again. The suggestion of moving indoors or into a private space might be reasonable, but it also upped the stakes. Inviting Mr. Collins inside would be a statement, a leap of trust they weren't sure they could afford, not with the neighbors watching and rumors always ready to ignite. Not with so many unknowns surrounding this man and his sudden reappearance. Darius looked from Mr. Collins to Angela, waiting to see what she would do. He noticed her eyes flickered toward the sky, where thunderheads pressed closer, grumbling low. Maybe she was thinking that a storm would break any minute, and that these men wouldn't stay outdoors in the rain. Maybe she was weighing the risk of letting them in against the risk of turning them away, and appearing ungrateful, or worse, suspicious. His own heart pounded. He recalled how he had left Mr. Collins with nothing but a kind word, no expectation of return. Now the man stood here, polite yet insistent, seemingly determined to repay a debt no one had asked him to honor. Darius wondered if gratitude alone had brought Mr. Collins back, or if something deeper and more complicated lay beneath that polished exterior. Before Angela could respond, the sound of distant thunder rolled across the sky, a low warning. Darius swallowed, aware of the children still peering through the chain-link fence, of the neighbors hidden behind their curtains, waiting for a sign of what would happen next. He could taste the tension in the air, and knew that whatever decision Angela made would shape the course of the hours and days to come. Mr. Collins remained poised, confident and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. Darius realized that in this moment, the two of them, he and his mother, held the real power. They could say yes or no, could accept or refuse. The neighborhood watched, silent witnesses to a quiet standoff in broad daylight. The sky grumbled again, darker and closer. Darius inhaled, steadying himself, unsure whether to feel hopeful or wary. He just knew that things were changing, right here in front of their worn porch. And he couldn't help wondering what would happen when they finally invited these unexpected visitors in. Or sent them away empty-handed. Mr. Collins lingered at the edge of the porch steps, the rumble of distant thunder underscoring his measured words. He adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket and cleared his throat, a subtle gesture that commanded attention without force. Darius felt his heart flutter at the silence that followed, as though the entire neighborhood held its breath, waiting to see what this man would say next. "I realize I never introduced myself properly," Mr. Collins said, his voice low and steady. He stood straight-backed under the gathering storm clouds, each sentence precise and calm. "My name is Christopher Collins. I'm a civil rights attorney." A murmur rustled through the onlookers, who dared to watch from behind curtains and chain-link fences. Darius caught a faint shift in Angela's stance. Her grip on the porch railing loosened, just slightly. He could almost see her thoughts turning. A lawyer? Here? Why? Mr. Collins continued, his gaze sweeping from Darius to Angela, then back again. "When we met on the highway that night, I was in a vulnerable place," he said, dipping his head respectfully to Darius. "Your help may have seemed small to you, changing a tire, refusing payment, but it was more than just a kind gesture. In that moment, you reminded me that empathy still survives in this world, even where it's least expected." Darius felt a warmth rise to his cheeks. He remembered that night clearly, how he had knelt on cracked asphalt, working the lug nuts loose while his mother kept the car running, ready to bolt if anything went wrong. He had known nothing of Mr. Collins then, just that the man needed help. Now to hear that his small effort had mattered this much took him by surprise. He lowered his eyes, uncertain how to react. Pride mingled with caution. He believed Mr. Collins's words, but that didn't mean he understood where this was going. Angela cleared her throat. "We didn't do it expecting anything in return," she said, voice careful but sincere. "We just saw you needed help." Collins nodded. "I know. That's what makes it meaningful. In my line of work, I've seen a great deal of hardship and injustice. The communities I serve often lose faith that anyone will lend a hand without some ulterior motive. But you proved me wrong." He glanced around, acknowledging the quiet houses and hesitant watchers. "You did good without knowing who I am or what I could do for you." Darius sensed a shift in the atmosphere. The earlier tension, fed by gleaming SUVs and unfamiliar suits, softened. Still, he noticed Angela's shoulders were not fully relaxed, nor did the neighbors step out onto their porches. Trust didn't bloom easily around here. Mr. Collins took a careful step forward, one hand raised to show he meant no harm. "I've been searching for a way to repay that moment of humanity," he said, "to show you that kindness does not go unnoticed." He turned his head slightly, gesturing toward the sleek SUV behind him. "I'd like to invite you both for a short ride. I know it's a lot to ask. You have every reason to be cautious." At these words, Angela's knuckles turned white again, just a hint. Darius felt his pulse thrum in his ears. Climbing into a stranger's vehicle, no matter how polished, did not come naturally. It certainly didn't feel safe. But Mr. Collins didn't push. He merely let the invitation hang in the humid air, his associates standing calmly a few steps behind. Angela managed after a long pause. Her voice was firm, but quieter than before, as if weighing each syllable. "What's so important you need to take us somewhere else to talk?" Darius appreciated her directness. He would have asked the same had his throat not felt tight. The neighbors were listening, he knew. The children behind the fence peered through the links, wide-eyed, as if this were some kind of movie playing out before them. Mr. Collins pressed his lips together thoughtfully before answering. "I can explain in more detail once we're away from prying eyes and ears." He spoke with quiet conviction. "I promise you, I mean no harm. In fact, I believe I can offer something that might help your family in the long run." His gaze met Darius's, and in that look, Darius sensed sincerity. He couldn't say why. It might have been the steadiness of Mr. Collins's voice or the way he acknowledged their discomfort, but something told him this was more than a hollow gesture. Angela hesitated. She looked to Darius, searching his eyes. He could tell she was torn. On one hand, this situation felt risky. On the other, there was a gravity in Mr. Collins's tone that hinted at something genuine, something that could matter to them. He remembered their struggles, Marcus's wrongful incarceration, the financial strain, the questions about the future. What if Mr. Collins held a key to some door they had long found locked? Rain began to tap softly at the porch roof, each drop punctuating the silence. Darius took a slow breath, feeling his heart settle somewhat. "Ma," he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. "Oh, we can be careful, but maybe we should listen to what he has to say." Angela's eyes flicked from her son back to Mr. Collins. She still looked uncertain, but now there was a spark of curiosity. It wasn't every day a well-dressed attorney parked outside their home, claiming to be moved by a simple act of kindness. "We'll go," she said at last, her voice firming as she spoke, "but just for a short ride, and if we're not comfortable, we come right back. Understood?" Mr. Collins inclined his head graciously. "Understood. Your comfort and safety are my priority." One of the associates stepped forward, not menacingly, but to open the SUV's rear door, revealing a spotless interior with leather seats. The scent of something subtle and expensive drifted out, so foreign to the familiar smells of their neighborhood that it momentarily disoriented Darius. He glanced back at the children behind the fence, their eyes shining with curiosity. The neighbors remained cloaked in silence, some pretending not to watch, others not bothering to hide their intrigue. Darius wondered what stories would fly through the block as soon as they pulled away. Perhaps it didn't matter. This felt like stepping onto a different path, one he never expected to find himself on. Angela straightened her blouse and stepped down from the porch. She held herself with dignity, not a trace of fear showing in her face, even though Darius sensed the tension just beneath. He followed, each footfall careful on the worn steps, and together they moved toward the SUV. Mr. Collins watched them approach, his expression calm but earnest. The sky grumbled again, as if to remind them that time was passing. This invitation, this short ride, might be nothing more than a conversation. Or it might be the start of something new, something that could ripple through their lives. Darius didn't know yet. He only knew that when he slid onto the leather seat beside Angela, he still carried with him the memory of a roadside encounter where he'd chosen to help a stranger, an act that might now shape their future in ways he could not yet imagine. Mr. Collins followed them in, closing the door with a gentle click. The other SUVs would trail behind, presumably. The rain picked up, tapping against the windshield like eager fingers. Darius's heart beat steadily in his chest. He was still uncertain, but he was ready to see where this strange new turn would lead. The SUV's interior glowed with the subdued light that reflected off polished wood trim and soft leather seats. Outside, rain streaked the tinted windows, turning the neighborhood's familiar outlines into watercolor smears of gray and green. Darius settled beside Angela, tense and upright, their breathing quiet but charged with anticipation. On the opposite seat, Mr. Collins faced them, elbows relaxed on the armrests. He had chosen a moment when the doors were closed and the engine's hum comforted them like white noise, sealing them off from watchful eyes and curious neighbors. The other associates took their places in the front, murmuring softly to one another as they prepared to move. Mr. Collins cleared his throat, meeting Darius's eyes first. His voice was calm, gentle even, as though he understood they needed reassurance. "I've done some looking into your family's circumstances," he began. His words were weighted, chosen with care. "Specifically, your father's case, Darius." At the mention of Marcus, Angela's hand drifted toward her son's. Darius felt her fingers hover just above his wrist, as if unsure whether to grip him tightly or keep her touch steady. He inhaled, heart pounding. Until now, nobody outside their immediate circle seemed to care about Marcus's fate. They had battled for so long to keep hope alive that hearing his father's name spoken here, in this refined setting, felt so right. "What do you know about it?" Angela asked softly. Her tone carried the wariness of someone who'd been disappointed too many times. She pressed her lips together as if bracing herself for bad news or hollow sympathy. Mr. Collins leaned forward slightly, still maintaining a respectful distance. "I know that Marcus was accused of a crime he did not commit," he said, voice steady. "I know that the evidence used against him was unreliable at best, and I strongly suspect it was tampered with. There were witnesses who never came forward, or who were never properly interviewed. There were documents that disappeared or were never produced at trial." He paused, allowing his words to sink in, before adding, "I know that the justice system failed him, failed all of you." "Oh," a quiet gasp slipped from Angela's lips. Darius felt a rush of emotion so intense he had to blink to keep his vision clear. How long had they struggled with this truth alone, like a secret weight pressing on their chests? He knew his father was innocent. He'd known it since day one, had lived with that certainty in every fiber of his being. But few outside their family acknowledged it. Hearing it now, stated plainly, made his throat tighten. The SUV's engine shifted gears, and the vehicle began to roll smoothly forward, leaving their block behind. Darius stole a glance out the window. The rain blurred everything, and he couldn't tell if any neighbors still watched. Perhaps it didn't matter anymore. Here, in this private space, reality was reshaping itself. They were no longer just a weary family with no recourse. Someone else had noticed. Someone with power. "I'm a civil rights attorney," Mr. Collins continued, folding his hands. "I've dealt with cases like your father's before. Not exactly the same, of course, but similar patterns. Broken trust in the system, hidden evidence, testimonies ignored or coerced. It's more common than it should be." Angela's eyes shimmered with barely contained hope, though her jaw remained tight. "You say this, but what can you do?" she asked, voice nearly cracking. She'd spent years balancing on a knife's edge. Too much hope and disappointment would crush her. Too little, and she'd surrender to despair. Now, faced with a man who claimed he could help, she wavered between embracing his words and pushing them away to avoid hurting him further. Mr. Collins offered a small, empathetic smile. "I've looked into getting the records unsealed and re-examined. I'm also aware of a few witnesses who might be willing to speak now, people who were too afraid or pressured to come forward before. With proper legal representation and renewed media attention, we stand a chance of exposing what really happened. My team and I want to help you bring Marcus home." His voice did not waver. It carried a quiet conviction that sounded sincere. Darius's eyes brimmed with tears he could no longer hold back. He tried not to blink too fast, tried not to let them spill openly down his cheeks, but a few escaped anyway. He imagined his father walking through their front door, the click of the latch, the light in Angela's eyes. Jasmine rushing forward, and himself, taller now, older, able to show his dad that he had grown into someone capable of standing up for what was right. The thought was almost too much. He choked out a quiet sound, half laugh, half sob, and quickly lifted a hand to wipe his face. Angela watched her son, and then turned her gaze back to Mr. Collins. Despite her rising hope, caution still laced her every word. "We've heard kind words before," she said quietly. "People say they want to help, that they're sorry, but nothing changes." Her voice was steady, but Darius could hear the pain beneath it, the weight of years spent waiting. Mr. Collins inclined his head, acknowledging her doubt. "I understand," he said. "I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. All I ask is that you allow my team to try, to review the records, speak to people, and build a case strong enough to be heard. I'll keep you informed every step of the way." The rain picked up, its soft drumming on the roof intensifying. Darius felt the car's motion smooth beneath him as they turned down unfamiliar streets. He wondered where they were headed, but the question felt secondary now. Everything hinged on whether this man, this attorney who spoke so calmly of justice, could do what he claimed. Angela closed her eyes briefly, as though centering herself. When she opened them again, she looked at Darius. The two of them exchanged a long, searching glance. There was no need for words. They knew each other's hearts well enough. Darius found his voice first, still thick with emotion. "If there's a chance to bring him home," he said softly, "we have to try." I turned back to Darius with the same expression I'd previously used. Emily now glimpsed my hand extended before me. Angela nodded, reaching for Darius's hand and squeezing it gently. Then she turned to Mr. Collins, her expression cautious yet resolute. "We'll listen," she said, choosing each word carefully. "We'll cooperate. But understand, we've lived with broken promises for a long time. We need proof that something can really be done." Mr. Collins leaned back slightly, relief and resolve mingling in his posture. "I will show you the proof," he promised. Everything will be done through proper channels. If the evidence is there, and I believe it is, we can overturn this injustice." Darius felt a trembling excitement in his chest. The possibility of his father's freedom hovered like a candle flame in a dark room, fragile, precious, and warm. Tears still stung his eyes, but this time he let them be. They were tears of longing and hope, tears that he never expected to shed in front of a stranger. They rode on through the rain-lashed streets, the world outside a blur. Inside the SUV, the future seemed to crack open, revealing a path that might lead Marcus home. Darius tightened his grip on his mother's hand, feeling her tremble just a little. And in that quiet moment, he believed that maybe Mr. Collins could deliver on his promise. Days blurred into one another, the calendar flipping forward in tense increments as Mr. Collins's legal team dug deeper into Marcus's case. Documents were unearthed, inconsistencies highlighted, and old evidence brought out of sealed boxes. While his classmates worried about tests and weekends, Darius found himself consumed by a different set of anxieties. He hovered at the intersection of hope and dread, sleepless nights leaving dark circles beneath his eyes. The weight of possibility pressed on him every waking moment. A good outcome now felt both tantalizingly close and heartbreakingly fragile. The courthouse rose before them on the morning of the first hearing like a fortress of intimidation. Cold stone steps, double doors of polished wood, and metal detectors manned by guards who spared them little more than a grim stare. Angela led the way inside, her chin lifted as if determined to face down any threat. Behind her came Darius, heart pounding, and Jasmine, silent and focused. The lines of fatigue etched into her features. Mr. Collins and his team were already ahead, slipping through the halls with the confidence of people who had walked this way many times before. They gave small nods of reassurance, though Darius noted the worry crinkling at the corners of their eyes. Outside, uniformed officers patrolled the block, some leaning against their cars, others standing stiff-backed by the entrance. Darius could feel their stares boring into him as he passed. He sensed their suspicion, as if they questioned his right to be there, to seek justice for a father they might consider just another statistic. The tension gnawed at him. He felt small under their gaze, yet also defiant, a spark of indignation lighting inside his chest. He had the right to be here, to stand up for his family. Still, fear trailed him like a shadow. Inside the courtroom, high ceilings and dark wooden pews absorbed whispers and footsteps into a hush that weighed heavily on everyone present. The air smelled faintly of floor polish and stale coffee. Darius took his seat between Angela and Jasmine. He could feel the tension in their bodies. Angela's shoulders drawn tight, Jasmine's foot tapping lightly against the floor. There was something about official proceedings, the impassive judge, the murmuring court clerk, and the rustle of legal papers that set Darius's nerves on edge. He swallowed hard, wishing he could say something reassuring, but words dried up in his throat. When Mr. Collins rose to speak, Darius leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head lowered, as if trying to catch every syllable. The attorney's voice was measured and direct, unafraid to call out discrepancies. He introduced new evidence with careful precision, pointing out contradictions in witness statements and the chain of custody for critical files that had vanished years ago. Darius's jaw clenched when he heard how easily things had gone wrong in Marcus's original trial. How had no one stopped it? How had so many people turned a blind eye? In the gallery behind them, a small cluster of supporters, neighbors who remembered Marcus, a distant relative, and a few curious onlookers, shifted uncomfortably. Darius knew some of them doubted anything could change. The system didn't suddenly correct itself after years of silence. But Mr. Collins's determination shone like a blade. He questioned, he presented, he refused to let half-truths stand. Darius took courage in that, even as doubt gnawed at his belly. Between hearings, the family waited in long, drafty corridors where the hum of fluorescent lights made everything feel hollow. Angela would press a thermos of herbal tea into Darius's hand, and Desmond would offer him a brief, tight smile. There were no guarantees, no promises that this would end well. Each adjournment left them suspended in uncertainty. Darius tried to be patient, but impatience burned in him. He wanted results, now. He wanted to wake up to a world where Marcus came home, unlocking their front door, filling the living room with his laughter again. Weeks passed in a haze of paperwork and testimony. Mr. Collins deposed old witnesses, some reluctant, some eager to right a past wrong. Darius hated the waiting game. He hated how each hearing began with so much tension and ended with no resolution. He hated how officers outside still gave him those wary looks, as if he might cause trouble just by existing. But he never stopped showing up. He dressed neatly, held his head high, and sat quietly through every proceeding. Angela and Jasmine did the same. They formed a resolute line, a family determined not to be broken again. Late on a Friday, after one particularly grueling session, Darius slipped outside to find a moment of fresh air. The sky was overcast, the courthouse looming behind him. He rested his back against the building's cold stone wall and exhaled. He looked up at the clouds and wondered if justice, like the sun, would ever break through. He tried to believe in what Mr. Collins said, that the truth could surface, that the lies and distortions would be stripped away. But he had seen so much disappointment, so many doors closed in their faces. Footsteps approached, Jasmine, hand resting gently on his shoulder. She said nothing, just stood with him, looking at the dreary afternoon light. Angela joined them a moment later, her eyes distant, calculating what steps might come next. Darius noticed how weary they both seemed, how desperately they needed a good outcome. The pressure of it weighed on him too, pressing down on his ribcage. They wanted something real, something they could hold onto, not just hope spun into pretty words. When Mr. Collins emerged from the courthouse doors, tie slightly askew, he offered them a small nod. He spoke quietly of next steps, more records to request, a key witness they were trying to track down. Darius forced a smile. He wanted to trust this man. He remembered how Mr. Collins had appeared at their door, how he'd spoken of gratitude and doing right by them. He saw no deceit in the attorney's eyes, only a fierce and resolve. That had to be enough, for now. The next hearing came and went, each minute ticking by like a clock wound too tight. Inside, Darius listened to the lawyers' voices echo off the paneled walls. He balled his hands into fists on his lap, careful not to disturb Angela on his left, or Jasmine on his right. They all flinched when the opposing side tried to dismiss new evidence, claiming it was too old, too unreliable. Mr. Collins rose calmly, countering their arguments with clear logic. Refusing to let them slip free, Darius could see anger brightening his mother's cheeks, frustration tightening his sister's jaw. He felt it too, flooding his veins with heat. How many barriers would they face before someone acknowledged the truth? As they filed out after another adjournment, Darius's stomach churned. He'd scarcely eaten since dawn, nerves stealing his appetite. Outside, the police officers still lingered, watchful and unsmiling. Darius forced himself to meet their eyes briefly, refusing to duck his head, then pressed on. He wouldn't let their stares define him. He belonged here. They were a family fighting for what they deserved. Back at home, evenings passed in a quiet tension. Angela and Jasmine took careful turns cooking simple meals and tidying up. Darius tried to focus on schoolwork, but his mind drifted back to the courtroom each time he turned a page. Sleep came reluctantly, bringing dreams where he sat alone in the silent chamber, waiting for a verdict that never arrived. But he kept going. They all did. The hearings continued, and so did Mr. Collins, chipping away at lies and old wounds. Step by step, he pried open cracks in the official narrative, letting in light. Darius clung to that light, thin, wavering, but present. He knew fear and indignation wouldn't vanish overnight. He understood that justice was never guaranteed, that it had to be wrestled from systems resistant to change. Still, he held on to the possibility that his father's innocence could be recognized, that after all these years, the truth might finally prevail. Doubt filled the spaces between heartbeats, but determination moved them forward. Nothing was resolved yet. Nothing certain. Yet Darius lifted his chin each time he entered that courthouse, shoulders squared between Angela and Jasmine, braced against the wary eyes and the lingering silence. He would face his fear. He would bear his anger, if it meant one day seeing his father walk free. The morning air felt sharper than usual as Darius stepped through the courthouse doors alongside Angela and Jasmine. The sky was clear, a pale blue as if painted on fresh canvas. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed softly, and the scent of polished wood lingered in the halls. Each step Darius took seemed to echo, magnifying his unease and his hope in equal measure. He couldn't predict what would happen today. Nobody could. But this was the day they had all waited for, after weeks stretching into months, after layers of evidence painstakingly peeled back. Something had changed. Mr. Collins's words echoed in his mind. New evidence, solid and undeniable. Darius clung to that phrase like a life raft. In the courtroom, the hush was immediate. The worn pews where they'd spent so many tense hours now held a quiet crowd of onlookers, supporters, curious strangers, local reporters who had caught wind of the story. Darius took his usual seat between Angela and Jasmine, feeling the warmth of their bodies pressed close. Angela gripped the edge of the bench so tightly, her nervous energy. Darius drew a slow breath and let his eyes find Mr. Collins at the front of the room. The attorney stood with his team, tie straight, shoulders relaxed, as if he knew the script of what would unfold. They waited. Seconds stretched thin, elongating until Darius felt he could count every dust mote floating in the beam of light that slanted through the high windows. He focused on small details. The sleek sheen of Mr. Collins's briefcase, the polished nails of the court stenographer, the careful arrangement of folders on the prosecution's table. It was a way to hold himself steady, to keep from trembling. Then the judge entered. Everyone rose, the collective rustle of fabric and muffled coughs, a kind of ritual. They settled back into their seats, and the silence deepened, pressing around them like a second skin. Darius locked his gaze onto the judge's face, searching for any clue. The judge's expression was measured, giving nothing away. Still, hope flared in Darius's chest, bright and fierce. It happened so quietly. The judge cleared his throat, shuffled a few pages, and began to speak. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through the room. New evidence had come to light. Darius's heart pounded at those words, as if marking the most important moment of his life. He listened, ears straining, as the judge explained that the evidence confirmed that key witness testimony had been suppressed, and that physical proof contradicting Marcus's guilt had never reached the original trial. It was all out in the open now. No more doubts left lurking in shadows. Darius heard Angela's breath hitch. Jasmine reached for his hand, squeezing so hard it almost hurt, but he welcomed the pain. He needed the anchor of her touch. Mr. Collins stood taller, though he did not smile yet. He merely watched the judge, waiting for those final words like a farmer waits for rain. The gavel struck, a sharp, decisive sound that reverberated through the chamber. The judge's voice rose above the silence. Marcus was declared a free man. There were no conditions, no delays. Just those 3 words, free at last. Darius jerked forward, as if pulled by an invisible cord. His heart soared so high it nearly blocked his throat, and before he knew it, tears blurred his vision. He was crying, and so were Angela and Jasmine. But these weren't tears of fear or frustration. They were tears of relief, joy, and something deeper, a sense of justice finally served. He turned to his mother first. Angela's face crumpled. Her usually steady composure shattered into grateful sobs. She pressed a hand to her mouth, shaking her head in disbelief. Jasmine's tears ran freely down her cheeks, and she laughed, a choking, half-sobbing laugh that filled the quiet room with raw emotion. They clung to one another, 3 points of a family that had spent years missing a vital piece. Now that peace was restored. Darius wanted to run, to burst from the bench and find his father, to wrap him in an embrace that would bridge all the lost time. But the bailiffs had their procedures, and Marcus would be brought out shortly. For now, Darius settled for gripping Angela and Jasmine tight, letting the moment wash over him. Mr. Collins caught his eye and offered a single nod. It wasn't triumphant or boastful, just calm and pleased, as if acknowledging that what was right had finally been done. In that nod, Darius sensed the weight that had lifted from the lawyer's shoulders too. Together they had pushed against the machinery of a flawed system until it yielded. Darius would never forget that this man, who had started as a stranger he helped on the roadside, had turned out to be the one person who could bring Marcus home. As people began to stir, whispering in astonishment or clapping softly, Darius looked toward the door from which his father would appear. He remembered Marcus's voice telling him to hold tight to his dreams, to work hard, to believe in himself. He recalled dim evenings when Angela would read Marcus's letters aloud at the kitchen table, hope trembling in her voice. He thought of how Jasmine had worked grueling hours, as if her sweat and perseverance could somehow anchor their broken family. And he remembered the countless nights he'd lain awake, aching with longing for his father's guidance. Soon Marcus would walk free, and they would all stand together under an open sky, no bars between them. Darius tried to picture the moment his father would step forward. He wanted to see Marcus's face when he realized it was finally over. He imagined Marcus's voice, deep and steady, maybe cracking with emotion as he reached for them. The mere thought made Darius's tears flow anew, gentler now, washing away years of tension and hurt. Jasmine leaned into Darius, shoulders shaking, and he put an arm around her. Angela pressed a kiss to both their foreheads, tears shining in her eyes. Outside the courtroom, reporters might already be clamoring, cameras poised, but that didn't matter right now. This was theirs. This moment of vindication and relief belonged to their family, fragile and strong all at once. In the front of the room, Mr. Collins gathered his papers methodically, as if to remind Darius that though the battle in the courtroom was over, life would move on. They would return home, rebuild their routine, learn to live as a whole family again. There would be challenges ahead. Healing didn't happen overnight, but this was a new starting point. Darius inhaled, letting the crispness of the morning fill his lungs. The tension that had coiled inside him for so long had unwound, replaced by a quiet gratitude and a willingness to believe in a future that was finally theirs to shape. As they waited for Marcus to be brought out, Darius realized that this day would forever mark a turning point in his life. From this moment on, he would remember that justice, though slow and uncertain, could still be won. And as long as they stood together, nothing, not even the darkest of pasts, could prevent them from moving forward. The courthouse steps were suddenly a stage, flooded with camera flashes and the electric hum of shouted questions. Darius stood beside Marcus, close enough to feel the subtle tremor in his father's arm as he shielded his eyes from the midday glare. After all those years behind concrete walls, the sunlight must have felt like a shock, brilliant and unforgiving. People pressed forward, reporters, curious onlookers, local activists, all hungry for a statement, a sound bite, something to capture this improbable moment. Angela and Jasmine hovered nearby, eyes still red from tears shed in the courtroom. Darius could see them forming a protective circle around Marcus, who blinked at the faces he hadn't seen in so long, the world of free people rushing up to meet him. Darius wanted to reach out and take his father's hand, to anchor him through the swirl of unfamiliar sights and sounds, but he held back, letting Marcus adjust on his own terms. Microphones thrust forward, catching fragments of voices. "How do you feel? What are your plans now that you're free? Any comment on the state's failure?" It was a chaotic chorus, words blending together until they became a buzzing hive that Darius could barely interpret. He noticed Marcus's eyes drifting over the crowd, searching. Darius raised a hand gently, drawing his father's gaze, and offered a small, reassuring nod. Marcus breathed out slowly, his shoulders easing just a bit. That was all they needed in that moment, a quiet understanding that they stood side by side as a family once again. Off to the left, Mr. Collins stepped up to an impromptu podium, a slim wooden stand hastily positioned at the top of the steps. The attorney raised his hand slightly, asking for calm, and to Darius's surprise, the crowd listened. Cameras still clicked, but the shouting subdued to a tense whisper. Mr. Collins surveyed the gathering, his posture confident but not arrogant, his expression measured. "Today," Mr. Collins began, his voice carrying over the murmurs, "we seen a wrong set right. Marcus's conviction was a product of failures in our justice system, failures that we cannot and must not ignore." His tone was clear and forceful, each sentence punctuated by the flash of cameras. Darius noticed how some reporters leaned forward, ready to pounce on every syllable, but Mr. Collins was as composed here as he had been in the courtroom, carefully illuminating the bigger picture. He continued, "Systemic injustice is not an abstract concept. It manifests in real lives, in stolen years, in families torn apart. Marcus's story is not unique. Too many people suffer from bias, negligence, and the withholding of truth." Darius felt a lump in his throat. Darius felt a sob latent in him with disorientation, despair, and a sense of something larger, a current that ran through countless other lives. Marcus listened quietly. Darius sensed his father was still gathering himself, still coming to terms with the fact that these words now applied to him as a free man and not a prisoner. Angela reached over and placed a gentle hand on Marcus's back, and Jasmine took his arm, as if reminding him that, from here on, he wouldn't be alone. Then Mr. Collins paused, glancing at Darius, and the boy stiffened, not sure what would come next. "There's another piece to this story," the attorney said. voice shifting subtly to something more personal. This all began with a small act of kindness on a lonely highway. When I was stranded, vulnerable, and out of options, a young man and his mother chose to help without hesitation, without any thought of reward. That simple gesture restored my faith in humanity, and it led me to re-examine Marcus's case. Without their compassion, we might not be standing here today. All eyes turned toward Darius and Angela. Darius felt a flush of heat warm his cheeks. The reporters adjusted their aim, lenses focusing on the boy who had sparked this chain of events. He saw recognition flicker in some faces. They might have heard rumors of his family's role in this story, but now they had confirmation. That memory of changing a tire in the dark, of refusing Mr. Collins's money, seemed both distant and achingly vivid. He hadn't asked for any of this attention, but he understood why Mr. Collins shared it now, to show that justice could rise from everyday goodness, that empathy could alter the course of someone's life. A reporter called out, "Darius, how do you feel about your father's release?" The voice was almost gentle. Darius swallowed, his throat tight. He glanced at Marcus, and in his father's eyes he saw a swirl of emotions: relief, gratitude, uncertainty. He finally dared to place a hand on Marcus's arm, steadying them both. "I'm just happy he's back where he belongs," Darius said quietly. The microphones might or might not catch his words, but it didn't matter. The truth of it was plain to anyone who cared to listen. Mr. Collins took that as his cue and pressed on. "We must remember that this outcome, while joyous, is also a reminder of how long Marcus waited and how hard we fought. Every individual wrongly imprisoned represents a moral failure on our part as a society. We must do better. We must hold those in power accountable and never stop fighting for fairness." The cameras flashed again, and Darius could hear murmurs building in the crowd. People jotted notes, recorded video, leaned in close to capture every nuance. He realized that this moment was no longer private. It belonged to the public now, a chapter in a larger narrative about justice and redemption. It felt strange, but not wrong. If sharing this moment could help others see the truth, maybe bring attention to other families who needed it, then it was worth it. Marcus cleared his throat, drawing their focus. He blinked under the harsh light, voice soft but steady. "I'm grateful to my family, who never gave up, and to Mr. Collins, who saw what was wrong and fixed it. And..." He paused, meeting Darius's eyes with a warmth that cracked through any lingering awkwardness. "To my son and my wife, who did what was right when no one was watching." A hush fell. Darius felt tears sting at the corners of his eyes again, not of sadness but profound relief. Angela's grip on Marcus's arm tightened. Jasmine wiped at her cheeks, and the crowd seemed to slow its frantic pace of questions. In that pause, Darius sensed something shift, as if the weight of the past was finally falling away. Mr. Collins gave a final nod, acknowledging both the family and the reporters. The press conference ended without fanfare, the small cluster of microphones withdrawing as the attorneys stepped back. Reporters began to disperse, some calling last-minute questions that went unanswered. The air felt lighter, as if the entire block had exhaled in unison. As the family gathered closer, Marcus took a tentative step toward the open street beyond the courthouse steps, his hand resting on Darius's shoulder. Angela and Jasmine flanked them, and Mr. Collins joined them at a respectful distance. They were free, at last, to walk away from this place, carrying a story that had started with a spare tire on a dark highway and ended with a broken man restored to his loved ones. Darius took in the scene. The cameras still lingering, the whispers in the crowd, the blue sky overhead. He realized that what had happened here was bigger than their family alone. It was a reminder that even a single act of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives they never expected to reach. And as he guided his father away from the courthouse, Darius held that lesson close, ready to begin the next chapter of their life together. They arrived home just as the sun dipped low, bathing the small rental house in a soft, golden light. The familiar creak of the porch steps sounded different tonight, less burdened, more hopeful. Angela unlocked the door, and the family stepped inside, each pausing as if seeing the cramped living room for the first time. Marcus lingered at the threshold, running his fingertips along the doorframe, the faded paint, the old marks from where Darius and Jasmine once measured their growing heights. It must have felt like stepping into a memory made real. Darius watched his father closely. Marcus's shoulders were broader than he remembered, and he moved with a certain stiffness, as if not yet accustomed to the absence of heavy doors and locked gates. The house smelled of cooked rice and cleaning solution, the scents that Angela and Jasmine wove into their daily routines. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling slowly. Darius could only guess what passed through his father's mind. Gratitude? Regret? Wonder? Maybe a longing for all the moments lost. Jasmine flicked on a lamp, and soft light fell across the worn couch and second-hand table. She hovered near the kitchen, uncertain whether to offer tea or let Marcus roam free in his own space, reacquainting himself with its contours. She watched Marcus carefully, her eyes bright with compassion and a lingering sadness for what had been stolen from them. "I tried this sweater last week, but it flashed off, so I thought I'd wait till this afternoon to clean and even up," chronicled in pencil on the page from the Book of Carrion. Darius felt both awe and longing tangled inside him, a knot of emotion he could not easily name. He remembered Marcus mostly through stories and fading childhood impressions, a gentle giant of a father who taught him how to hold a wrench, who read him bedtime stories before fate tore him away. Now Marcus stood just a few steps away, flesh and blood. But time had changed them both. They would need to learn each other's voices again, rediscover what it meant to be father and son after so many years apart. Outside, through the thin curtains, Darius noticed Mr. Collins' SUV still idling in the driveway. The engine purred quietly, headlights illuminating the gravel. It was as if the lawyer wasn't quite ready to leave, wanting to be sure they were truly settled. After all, he had helped bring Marcus home. Restoring a family that had nearly been crushed under injustice, Darius stepped onto the porch, leaning over the railing, and met Mr. Collins' gaze through the tinted window. The passenger side window lowered with a soft mechanical hum. Mr. Collins nodded to Darius, and his voice, muffled by distance, carried a gentle warmth. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "Your courage, your kindness, it made a difference." He reached across to the passenger seat for something, then gestured for Darius to approach. Darius slipped off the porch and crossed the short distance to the SUV. He felt the gravel crunch beneath his shoes, and a mild evening breeze brush his cheeks. At the open window, Mr. Collins handed him a sealed envelope. The paper felt heavy, as if it contained not just a letter, but the promise of something more. Darius looked down, puzzled, then back up at Mr. Collins, who offered no immediate explanation, just a reassuring smile. "It's a scholarship opportunity," Mr. Collins said softly. "I've got connections with some educational foundations that support young people who show extraordinary moral character under difficult circumstances. Consider it a way for your future to open up, just as your father's has now." He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. "You earned it without even knowing. And if you need help navigating the details, you know where to find me." Darius's chest tightened, gratitude and disbelief colliding in his mind. A scholarship. He'd dreamed of escaping the tight circle of poverty, of achieving something more than what their circumstances allowed, yet he never imagined it would come from a quiet moment on a dark highway, from a decision to help a stranger. It felt both surreal and perfectly logical, as though one act of goodness had sown seeds that were now flowering in unexpected ways. "Thank you," Darius said, voice quiet but earnest. He wanted to say more, to explain how much this meant, but the words jumbled in his throat. Instead, he pressed the envelope against his chest, hoping Mr. Collins understood his silence. Mr. Collins nodded once more, then tapped the side of his door. "I'll leave you all to it. You have a lot of catching up to do." With that, the window rolled up, and the SUV backed slowly out of the driveway, its headlights tracing a gentle arc across the yard, before disappearing down the street. Darius watched the red glow of the taillights fade. The world around him felt different now. Slightly wider, a horizon no longer blocked by uncertainty and fear. He tucked the envelope under his arm and returned to the porch, where he found Marcus standing in the doorway, framed by the warm light inside. "Everything all right?" Marcus asked, voice soft and measured. He had missed so many things: birthdays, holidays, Darius's first day of school, Desmond's quiet sacrifices, Angela's late-night cleaning shifts. He seemed eager to know every detail, to close the gap in understanding that stretched between them. Darius nodded, stepping inside. "Yeah, it is," he said quietly, holding up the envelope. "Mr. Collins wanted me to have this. It's some kind of scholarship." A flicker of pride warmed Marcus's expression. He reached out, resting a hand on Darius's shoulder. A tentative but sincere gesture. "You deserve it. Your mother always said you had a good heart. You showed it when it mattered most." Inside the living room, Angela beckoned them closer, and Jasmine perched on the edge of the couch, leaning forward as if to gather them all in. Darius could sense their desire to start talking, to fill each other in on everything that had happened. Marcus's absence had carved a wound in their family, and now they had a chance to heal. But healing meant time, patience, and understanding. It meant rediscovering habits, learning the ways each person had grown and changed. Darius took a seat beside Marcus, noticing how his father studied every corner of the room, as if searching for clues about the life he'd missed. The worn upholstery on the couch, the slightly crooked picture frames, the stack of old magazines on the coffee table, each told a story of survival without him. Now they could begin writing a new story, one in which Marcus played a central role once more. Angela cleared her throat, voice steady but emotional. "We've been waiting a long time for this moment. Let's take it slowly. There's no rush." Jasmine nodded. "We have all the time we need now." Darius felt the envelope's corners press gently against his side, reminding him of the future that waited. He imagined studying late at night, delving into subjects that interested him, maybe finding ways to improve the world so others wouldn't suffer like his father had. He might become an advocate, or a teacher, or something he hadn't even considered yet. Whatever he chose, the path ahead felt more open than ever. Marcus rubbed his chin, still looking a bit overwhelmed by the freedom to choose his own actions again. "I want to know everything I've missed," he said quietly. "Everything about you two growing up, about what you've done, what you hope to do." Darius caught Angela's eye, and her face softened with the warmth of a home finally made whole. He imagined telling Marcus about his life bit by bit, piecing together the years with stories and laughter, apologies and reassurances. He wanted his father to understand the challenges they'd faced, but also the resilience they'd shown. He wanted Marcus to know that despite the hardship, they never stopped loving him, never stopped believing in his innocence. Outside, a faint breeze rustled through the yard. Without the SUV's engine, the neighborhood fell into a peaceful hush. Darius leaned into Marcus's side and felt his father's arm wrap around him, hesitant at first, then firm. Angela and Jasmine drew closer, and for a long moment they sat there, reunited in their modest home, the silence filled with promise. Darius closed his eyes. The horizon had changed indeed. A father restored, a future beckoning, and, in the driveway, just moments before, the quiet hum of an SUV departing, leaving behind not only a scholarship, but the assurance that kindness mattered and could forever alter the shape of their lives. The morning air felt lighter than it ever had before, as if the world had pressed a reset button overnight. Darius stepped onto the porch barefoot, the wood cool beneath his soles. The sky was painted in gentle shades of pink and orange, the sun inching its way above the distant rooftops. A mild breeze carried hints of dew and cut grass, scents that whispered of fresh beginnings. Inside the house, he could faintly hear the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of floorboards as his family stirred awake, each adjusting in their own way to this new reality. Marcus was home. That single truth still astonished him. His father slept in the next room, his breathing finally unrestricted by cold prison walls. Angela and Jasmine were both inside, likely tidying up, clinking mugs, perhaps starting coffee or sifting through the mail that had piled up over the days of court appearances and uncertainty. Darius knew that in the coming weeks they would all learn how to live together again, stitching together old memories and creating new ones. But this morning, he stood outside letting the early light wash over him, needing a moment to understand what it all meant. He closed his eyes and let his thoughts drift back to that pivotal night on the highway. He'd been tired, ready to go home, not expecting anything unusual. Then he had seen Mr. Collins's stranded car and insisted on stopping. That one decision, so small, so ordinary, had sparked a chain of events that nobody could have predicted. Darius recalled the way Angela's voice had wavered with concern, how he had pushed down his own uncertainty because doing nothing felt wrong. Changing that tire had only taken a few minutes, yet it had led them all here, to a morning humming with promise instead of fear. His family's fate had shifted in ways he'd never imagined. The quiet act of helping a stranger had brought Mr. Collins into their lives, revealing the truth and freeing Marcus from unjust confinement. Darius understood now that justice was not always delivered swiftly or fairly. It required persistence, courage, and occasionally unexpected allies. Even so, he'd seen how compassion could cut through layers of cynicism and wrongdoing. If one small act could help unravel such a deep injustice, what could a lifetime of such acts accomplish? The thought filled him with a steady warmth. He opened his eyes to watch the sun clear the horizon, its bright edges illuminating his neighborhood in a softer light. The houses, still worn at the edges, looked less ominous and more like canvases waiting for new colors. He knew the place hadn't changed overnight. Its struggles were still there, But now his perspective had widened. He no longer felt trapped by circumstance. Instead, he felt a quiet determination, like an ember glowing in his chest, waiting to be kindled into a flame. His mind turned to the envelope Mr. Collins had left behind, tucked safely inside the house. It promised a scholarship opportunity, an opening to a world Darius had only dared to dream about from a distance. He could go to college, maybe even law school. Before all this, the idea of standing up in a courtroom, defending someone's rights, or challenging an unjust system had seemed out of reach. Now it felt not only possible, but necessary. He imagined walking through the corridors of a university, learning about legal precedents, studying cases similar to his father's, honing his understanding of how the system worked and how it could be made better. He pictured himself standing before judges and juries, no longer silent, no longer powerless. He wanted to be the kind of person who turned kindness into action, who wielded the law like a tool for good, cutting through prejudice and corruption. A soft sound made him glance back through the doorway. He saw Angela adjusting the curtains, her movements graceful, but still cautious. Jasmine's voice drifted from the kitchen, low and calm, asking if anyone wanted breakfast. Marcus's voice, though he spoke quietly, carried a newfound ease. He was free, and this was his home now. Darius smiled to himself, heartened by their presence. He would join them soon, help set the table, or maybe warm some bread. But first, he needed this moment alone to lay claim to the future unfolding before him. Raising his face to the warming sky, he thought of the long journey behind them and the one yet to come. True growth and redemption often started with small, unexpected gestures. He understood this now. It wasn't just about that night on the highway. It was about every decision he would make going forward. If he could use his strength, his intellect, and his empathy to right wrongs, even in small ways, then perhaps he could honor what his family had endured. He could honor the faith Mr. Collins placed in him and the second chance fate had offered them all. The sun rose higher, chasing shadows from the porch. Darius took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the air of a new chapter. There would be challenges ahead, adjusting to life with Marcus again, navigating the scholarship process, preparing himself for the demands of higher education. Not everyone would welcome him with open arms, and he knew that systemic problems didn't vanish overnight, but hope was a formidable anchor, and knowledge would be his compass. He would learn, he would fight, and he would do so not just for himself but for others who might be trapped in places as dark as his father once was. With one last glance at the brightening sky, Darius stepped off the porch and back inside. In the modest living room, Angela caught his eye and smiled softly, as if sensing the shift within him. Jasmine slid a plate of toast onto the table. Marcus stood by the window, watching them, quietly absorbing the rhythms of a home he had nearly forgotten. Darius reached for a chair, ready to share a meal, ready to laugh and plan and dream. In that moment, he could feel his future come into focus. He saw himself moving forward with steady footsteps, armed with lessons learned from hardship and hope. He understood that the best changes started within, rooted in the courage to help a stranger, the willingness to trust justice might prevail, and the determination to keep pushing until it did. As the day unfurled, Darius knew he was stepping into a new dawn, one he had helped create, one where his family would thrive, and where he would grow into the kind of man who believed, unwaveringly, in the power of doing what was right.